From the very first moment you see her, Mozu makes it clear that she is a training project. Much like Magikarp from Pokemon, she isn't even able to deal any damage on her own, instead depending on dual strikes or stat boosts from other units. Fire Emblem is no stranger to this type of character. Sometimes they're referred to as villagers, trainees, ests, or for the especially unhinged, the Cliff archetype. Usually these units are considered pretty underpowered by the community, but Mozu is kind of interesting. She has 3 separate appearances in the Birthright, Conquest, and Revelation routes, and despite the fact that her inherent traits do not change at all, her strength as a unit varies quite wildly. In Conquest, there's an argument that Mozu is the best trainee in the series. She has the ability to become an archer and provide that class line to up to 3 other units. And in Conquest, this is an extremely valuable trait, as bows are an incredibly effective weapon for nuking enemies, especially flyers, and Archer provides some unique and powerful skills. Not only that, but Chapter 10 has some flyers for Mozu to pick on, meaning that unlike training projects in other games, Mozu doesn't need kills set up for her. She can contribute to your game plan while also gaining a ton of experience for herself. On the other hand, in Fire Emblem Birthright, Archer is neither desirable nor unique. You get 2 others and both of them would rather start in a different class line. As a result of this, if Mozu wants to do anything in Birthright, it's in her underwhelming villager class. And while Birthright is an easy enough game that you can turn whoever you want into a carry, even on the highest difficulty, Mozu is going to take a good deal more favoritism than even other low-tier units, and she doesn't offer anything unique in exchange. But I'm not interested in Birthright or Conquest. I'm rev-pilled all the way, baby. So what I want to know is, will Mozu help you on your journey to kill Anonkos, or is it better to abandon the villager girl and focus on your hardened warriors? This video is part of an ongoing series with the goal to do a deep dive into every single playable unit in Fire Emblem Fates Revelations. Yes, even that one. Despite the fact that the game has a reputation for being terribly unbalanced, I truly believe that every member of the cast can contribute to your team. But units in Fates are highly customizable, and this goes doubly so for Revelations, where each cast member has new options that are not available on their native routes. And so my goal is to go over the multiple potential builds that every member of the roster has. That way, if you want to play through Rev on its highest difficulty, you can utilize whoever your favorite characters are. I'm not going to pretend that all of these units are equally viable. In fact, a secondary goal of the series is to come up with a Revelation tier list. But I really do believe that everyone is at least salvageable and can offer you something unique. While this series is going to be focused around the lunatic difficulty, much of what I say can also apply to the lower difficulties of hard and normal. Those difficulties have lower numbers for the enemies, so it's easier to reach stat thresholds, but things like various reclasses, available friendships, and specific builds that you can go into stay universal despite what difficulty you intend to play on. With all that out of the way, let's dive into our unit review. God, that's either the worst or best series name I've come up with. There's no middle ground. Talking about Fates units is always complicated, but Mozu opens some additional complications. Before we can even discuss her base stats and growth rates, we have to go over a couple of things. The first of which is her join time. Mozu is unique in that she is the only character with a variable join time who does not ever scale. All of the other characters recruited from Paralouge are children, who get an extra 2 levels for every chapter you delay them. There's also 2 My Castle characters, Fuga and Flora, and while they do not always scale, they will start scaling after chapter 23. However, Mozu will always be a level 1 villager even if you recruit her directly before the final map of the game. With this in mind, it seems reasonable to recruit Mozu as quickly as possible, and she becomes available in between chapters 7 and 8 on all routes. However, I would discourage you from recruiting her immediately upon completing Chapter 7. And that's because recruiting Mozu is not the only thing you get out of completing Paralouge 1. The chapter contains a large number of enemy faceless, and you can have your other characters fight them to build supports, weapon rank, and even gain experience. Although, as the faceless themselves also do not scale, if your characters are high enough level, they won't be gaining much EXP from combat. Regardless of what route you're on, I would generally recommend delaying Paralouge 1 until you have enough units to fill all of the deployment slots, so you don't waste any support potential. I would say that the ideal time to do Mozu's Paralouge in Birthright is in between chapters 8 and 9, while the ideal time to do it in Conquest is in between chapters 9 and 10. Although it is worth noting that if you have specific support pairings you want to get as quickly as possible, delaying Paralouge 1 in order to give you more maps to grind up support points is definitely a viable strategy, especially if you don't plan on using Mozu on your team. But when it comes to my favorite route, Rev, the timing of Paralouge 1 is a little bit up in the air. Personally, I think the best time to do it is in between chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 9 represents a pretty significant difficulty spike, and this is the first time where you have enough units to fully fill out the deployment slots in Paralouge 1, although one of those slots will be occupied by Gunter, who cannot gain support ranks and has limited benefit from gaining experience. However, while Gunter doesn't benefit much from fighting the Faceless, his dual strikes are invaluable and can help the Scrub Squad gain the levels and support ranks that they so desperately need. Hana, Tsubaki, and Mozu in particular really benefit from gaining extra experience on Paralouge 1 in preparation for Chapter 9. But even Kaze appreciates both building support ranks and gaining some more experience. Even though he had time to grow during Branch of Fate, getting him to level 10 for the extra stats and Poison Strike can be quite beneficial, and for this reason, I tend to route Paralouge 1 and Invasion 1 right in between chapters 8 and 9. This timing is also quite useful for Mozu. While she theoretically could benefit a little bit from the chapter 8 experience if you grabbed her for that map, she would still be fighting over a deployment slot with either Azura, your servant, or Gunter, none of whom can really be said to be less valuable than her. Meanwhile, if you're training Mozu, it's perfectly reasonable to bench Hana for Chapter 10. And if you're dead set on training both of them, giving up Sakura is also not the worst thing in the world, although it does mean that early servant should probably remain in a staffing class. I really think investing experience in Sakura Squad prior to Chapter 10 is the best use of Mozu's Paralouge and Invasion 1. But if you think that you can handle Fuga's Wild Ride without the extra experience, then doing Mozu's Paralouge after Chapter 10, or even after Chapter 11, can help you with some support routing, as at that point you have access to Hayato, Takumi, Oboro, Hinata, Orochi, and Saizo. These units will be at the soft EXP cap, so they're not going to gain much from fighting the Faceless, but they can grind weapon rank and build supports. And getting these units married means that you will have access to their child Paralouges later, yielding you strong units in the late game, as well as the ability to use those Paralouges as EXP pinatas, which is a big part of getting your units their promoted skills in a reasonable time frame, especially if you have a build that wants level 15 skills. Personally, I would say if you're concerned about support routing, doing one of Invasion 1 or Mozu's Paralouge prior to Chapter 9 is still probably going to be beneficial, just because that extra experience can really help the Scrub Squad fight against Fuga's finest. And I don't think support routing in the mid-game is so difficult that you really need to delay either of them. Which is why, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be assuming that Mozu joins at the same time as Sakura Squad, in between chapters 8 and 9. Just bear in mind that it is possible to get access to her later or earlier, and there might be a reason for doing so, depending on the rest of your squad. As far as Mozu's stats are concerned, her bases are very unimpressive. She's slower than Gunter and hits less hard than Hana. But you would expect this out of a trainee unit, she's only level 1 after all. Her growth rates, on the other hand, are actually quite good by Fate's standards, particularly excelling in the strength, speed, skill, and luck departments, making her into a very powerful offensive powerhouse. Her HP, defense, and resistance aren't what I would call bad, but they're not good either, and considering that her bases are pretty abysmal, it's going to take a while before they get to the point where I would consider her an enemy phase unit. If given proper attention and experience, Mozu will hit hard and double foes, but she's not going to be able to take a beating very often. Only, here's the thing. I'm actually lying to you. Yes, these are Mozu's base stats, but they're not her growth rates. Well, I mean, technically these are Mozu's growth rates, but functionally they're not going to be Mozu's growth rates, because I haven't added the aptitude bonuses yet. And if I just... With aptitude factored in, Mozu's strength, speed, skill, and luck are almost overkill in how strong they are. She'll be getting these stats almost every level. And 10% doesn't seem like a lot, but it does push HP, defense, and resistance to the point where these growths are much more respectable than they were before aptitude. On average, aptitude is going to add 1 to every stat every 10 levels you get, or 4 to every stat across an entire playthrough if you reach 2020, which honestly isn't even guaranteed. So aptitude doesn't really serve as an extreme stat buffer for Mozu. Instead, it feels more like insurance. Having a 45% defense growth feels much more likely to get stat screwed than a 55% defense growth. Mozu still isn't going to be taking many hits, and Mozu is still going to primarily focus on hitting hard and doubling foes, which is why it's typically best to find a way to attack foes uncountered. And luckily for Mozu, she does have just that in her base kit. So if once again there we go, that's what Mozu looks like as an archer. Only no, I'm lying to you again, cause that's what Mozu looked like as an archer. Although, you might be wondering why this is such an upgrade. Her bases are barely different from Villager, and her growth rates are arguably worse, trading 5% in strength and speed for an upgrade to the already overkill skill. But Archer itself comes with some very desirable qualities. Bows have the highest might and highest hit of all weapon types, making them incredibly good and leaning into Mozu's ability to delete units on player phase. The fact that they attack from 2 range also helps her to avoid counters, both early on when she's frail because she's training, and later when she's frail because her defensive growths are not as good as her offensive ones. Bows are also a green weapon type, and in the early game your only other green weapon users are Rinka and Gunter, both of whom have their own problems. There are a lot of blue enemies in chapters 9 and 11, specifically ninjas and spear fighters, and even in other maps there are a frequent number of lance users that Mozu can take advantage of triangle over. And lastly, bows have the benefit that they always have of being able to attack from 2 range. But the more desirable thing about Archer compared to its weapon type is its skill set. At level 10, Mozu will get the Quick Draw skill, which gives +4 damage on player phase. Since her stat spread leans towards player phase action anyway, this is the equivalent to a +4 strength level up. Honestly, it's probably +5 because you're also getting strength on that level, let's be real. Compare this to the Villager level 10 skill of Underdog, which gives 15 hit and avoid when fighting enemies of a higher level, and I think Quick Draw wins out pretty handily. Mozu doesn't really have accuracy issues, and if you are wanting to improve her hit rates, Sniper offers Certain Blow alongside Bowfair, another damage boosting skill. Meanwhile, having the option to go Kinshi gives you flight access. Villagers' promotion paths are Merchant and Master of Arms, which can be desirable for specific builds, but generally offer less to units, especially a unit with Mozu's stat spread, than the Archer promotions will. The main draws from Master of Arms are the ability to increase your bulk, or the ability to grab the Life and Death skill at promoted level 15. Life and Death comes incredibly late and is only desired by some specific builds. Meanwhile, the bulk increase, while appreciated by Mozu, really does not lean into her strengths. Merchant is probably the better promotion from the Villager route since it gives you bow access, but Archer would give you bows much earlier, and therefore you would have a higher rank when it comes to promotion time. Merchant does give the Profiteer and Spendthrift skills, which can be a powerful combination, but much like Life and Death, this comes online very late, again promoted level 15. Even with intense Paralouge routing, that's going to be a late game thing at the very least. Instead of staying in Villager the whole time in hopes of getting that online, I think it's typically better to dip back into the Merchant class when it is time to gather the skills. With that in mind, I think under most scenarios, if you are using Mozu, she demands an early heart seal. And since she's already a unit who wants you to feed her quite a few kills to gain experience, this is a pretty tall order. So I think we should take a look at Mozu's performance both in the short and long term in order to determine whether or not this is worth the high investment cost. But before doing that, I want to briefly divert to one of the two other routes, because as I mentioned in the introduction, there's a case for Conquest Mozu being the strongest trainee in the series, and I want to look at specifically why she works in Conquest. That way we have something to compare her to when looking at her Rev iteration. In Conquest, if you delay Paralouge 1 until after Chapter 9, the majority of your units will have hit the soft EXP cap, and as a result of that, they're not really fighting over faceless kills. Instead, the main benefit your army gets from fighting these units is building their weapon rank and support levels, both of which get equal gains from either chip or kills. The notable exceptions to this rule are Odin and Arthur. If Arthur has been spending a bunch of time as a backpack, this is a good opportunity for him to catch up, especially if you want to grab Gamble so you can de-equip it for Chapter 10. Meanwhile, if Odin didn't get that much experience in Chapters 8 and 9, Paralouge 1 is a great opportunity for him to play backup. And I want to thank Blue Luna for pointing this out. I ran this audio by them and they pointed me to the Arthur and Odin situations, so if you want more in-depth Smart Conquest stuff, definitely check out their channel, it's linked in the description. But moving back onto the Mozu discussion, if you want to raise Mozu, she's not really contesting other units for kills, and in fact those other units existing can help her secure experience for herself, because she can take advantage of their dual strikes to kill enemies she doesn't even deal damage to. And these dual strikes will build weapon rank, so they're a benefit for both units involved. This allows Mozu to quickly gain experience and regularly leave Paralouge 1 at level 3, 4, or even 5, depending on how efficiently you feed her kills. But Paralouge 1 is not the only map mostly devoted to training your units, and Invasion 1 is another opportunity for Mozu to grab a couple of levels, especially since Invasion 1 features some wyverns, an enemy type that Mozu is especially adept at killing due to the bows dealing effective damage. Speaking of bows, we should talk about the Heart Seal competition. You get 2 Heart Seals prior to Chapter 10, and Mozu is actually one of the better candidates for them. Reclassing Corrin out of Noble is usually good, but prior to Chapter 10, using Dragonstone for dual strikes can be more beneficial than building Corrin's weapon rank. Paladin Jacob is nice if you're trying to do high invest Jacob, but personally I think a low invest Jacob is better in Conquest anyway. And this same principle applies to Felicia. Effie gets nothing out of Troubadour unpromoted, and while Silas does appreciate mercenary skills, I think he prefers staying in Cavalier for the powerful skills and movement that class provides in the early game. Conversely, while Arthur does like elbow room and shelter, losing your only fighter backpack is a pretty high cost for doing that, especially since Arthur's combat prospects are not the greatest in the cast. Outlaw Nyx is a must if you're doing a high invest Nyx build, but Nyx is one of the worst early game units, and so I typically think that most armies don't super want a high invest Nyx. Niles and Odin appreciate skills from their Heartseal class lines, but typically want to remain in their base class for most combat. And as a result of this, I don't think they're great targets for the early seal, since you would basically be committing to using the second one to send them back into Dark Mage and Outlaw respectively. Azura is also a unit who I would highly recommend against reclassing. Losing your Dancer isn't worth it even for a level 36 Kinshi Knight. Which leaves us with Wyvern Elise, who is generally one of the better targets for an early Heartseal. Flight combined with Wyvern bases are surprisingly competent in the early game, and allows her to build up axe rank to be a powerful Bolt Axe Malignite. But that's only one Heart Seal, and you do get 2 early on. As a result of this, Mozu is a pretty good contender for the second Heart Seal. Of course, depending on your team composition, Jacob and Nyx might be better, but I think for the average team, Mozu is going to be adding more than those units would. Of course, I've been talking about this as if you have to use the 2 early Heart Seals on the early game squad, and actually I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. Instead of thinking of them only as the 2 early game Heart Seals, it's better to look at the wider picture. They are not just 2 of your only early game Heart Seals, but they are also 2 of the only 5 Heart Seals you get prior to Chapter 21. And there are a lot of units who want to use a Heart Seal, or even 2, prior to Chapter 21. Silas wants to grab Soul to become a Soul Ninja, Xander likes going into Wyvern, while Baruka appreciates leaving it for the fighter line. Odin likes grabbing Vantage and using a second seal to get back when possible, and Kaze can do a similar thing. If Selena is to be a rally bot, then she wants to go Sky Knight at some point, while Laszlo and Soleil both have the option to go Ninja. Leo likes Sorcerer access for better magic and Nosferatu, and Shura wants to get out of Outlaw and into Bow Knight if you want to use him. Even Gunter appreciates a reclass to Wyvern for a better forceful partner pair-up. And of course, the longer the game goes on, the more likely Corrin is to want to dip into their Heart Seal talent. And while all of these choices are not equally good, and in fact some of them are not going to be good for most teams, they are competing with Mozu, so it's not quite as simple as just looking at the early game squad. Still, if you're willing to take that dive, then Mozu's early game actually becomes quite useful. As opposed to just being a pure training project, she can help you make progress towards the maps, especially on Chapter 10, where there are a large number of non-aggressive and quite weak Sky Knights who are nonetheless threatening due to their high mobility and desire to seize the seize points, giving you a game over. Mozu can not only one-shot them with a bronze bow, but you can take advantage of her dual strikes to allow other units to do the same. And this is not the only map that features flyers for Mozu to pick on. Chapter 13 has a large number of wyverns that it's nice to have a bow user against, and in Chapter 14 you get pincer attacked by some flying promoted enemies. If you do Kana or Percy's Paralouge early, there are scary flyers on those maps as well. And heading into the late game, there continue to be flyers to pick on. Fuga's map and Hinoka's map are prominent examples, but even Endgame has a couple of scary wyverns. But even putting aside flyers, Mozu is also quite good at picking on ninjas, due to the ability to counter them at 2 range with triangle advantage. Chapters 11 and 12 feature a large number of ninjas for whom this is the case, although it's much easier to set up enemy phases on 12 because that map has actual terrain, whereas 11 is mostly devoid of it. Moving on to the mid-game, Chapter 17 is often seen as a wall for new players, due to the large number of dangerous ninjas. But Mozu is a perfect solution to that map. Lastly, Mozu is the only person with access to the Archer class line. She can give it to others, but no one has it without her help. Both Sniper and Kinchi are very powerful classes throughout the mid and late game. While you can get Kinchi through Mozu, Selena, or Azura, giving it more flexibility, it is still nice to have this in your toolkit. And the Archer skills will only come from Mozu. Don't get it twisted, Mozu is definitely an investment project, both in terms of experience and having to give her the seal. But even just the seal immediately pays off due to the fact that her base performance is quite good in Invasion 1 and Chapter 10. With that in mind, let's take a look at Mozu in Rev. The most immediate difference for Mozu comes as early as Paralouge 1. If you do it prior to Chapter 9, Mozu is now competing for experience with Hana and Tsubaki, meaning that there is a good possibility that the experience and therefore levels and stats she gains will be divided in half or even in a third. Not only that, but it can be harder for her to secure kills. Dual strikes from Corrin, Gunter, and the early servant are useful, but the other units that you have aren't going to be doing as strong dual strikes as Mozu would like. Most of Kaze's power comes from doubling, and Hana and Tsubaki are on their own training arcs. Azura is a dancer and Sakura can't even attack. Don't get me wrong, it's very possible to feed Bowzu experience in Paralouge 1 and also Invasion 1, but it's going to be harder than it is in Conquest, and the experience is a more competed over resource. On the topic of Invasion 1, it is once again good for Mozu, in fact arguably better than the Conquest iteration. It still has flyers, and this time they're Sky Knights, so easier for her to one-shot. But it also features ninjas, who she has advantage over and can counter at 2 range, making her one of the better units for fighting them. If you do the Mozu grind, however, she does have a couple of good matchups in Chapter 9. My pick for the hardest map in the game. The majority of enemies on that map are Oni, spear fighters, and ninja, with some samurai and archers sprinkled in between, and 2 diviners, one of which is the sub-boss Hayato. While Mozu doesn't do great against the diviners due to weapon triangle disadvantage, and the high defense Onis are likely getting tinked by her even after some training, triangle advantage lets her do some chip to the spear fighters, which is impressive considering they don't have negligible defense either. And she is notably quite good against the ninjas, being able to even successfully enemy phase them with proper positioning. They have an effective 14 AS due to their iron shurikens, so you're not likely doubling them, but with enough training, Mozu can reach the coveted 10 speed threshold to not be doubled by them. And with weapon triangle advantage, she can hit the ninjas quite hard. This isn't as strong a showing as she has against the Sky Knights in Chapter 10, but it's also not nothing. The only other units who are particularly good at fighting the ninja are Kaze and Jacob, and you're not even guaranteed to have Jacob depending on your gender. In my opinion, this is enough for Archer Mozu not to feel like dead weight, but it doesn't really make her self-sufficient either. If she wants to get kills on the spear fighters, she's going to need Felicia, Jacob, or Kaze to debuff them. If she wants to kill the ninjas, she's going to need healing from your servant or Sakura. She's got questionable prospects against the samurai and is nearly hopeless against the Oni. While Chapter 10 doesn't give Mozu any noticeably good matchups, and in fact she's very bad against the mages at the end of the map, Chapter 11 is once again a point where bows shine. This map introduces the first promoted generic enemies in a group of master ninjas, who are very threatening and can one-round a lot of units even when trained up. Mozu's high speed growth ensures that if she's given proper experience, she won't be doubled by them, and triangle advantage means that she will not only not get one-shot, but she will often deal a significant chunk of damage back. But perhaps even more notably, there are a ton of regular ninjas who are still quite threatening to the majority of your units, and Mozu can fight them on player or enemy phase with equal aptitude. But Mozu is far from the only unit you have who is capable of fighting the ninjas or master ninjas. On that same map, you get access to Takumi and Reina, both of whom are incredibly powerful bow users in their own right. Takumi even has the benefit of sharing the archer class with Mozu to get access to the same skills. Not only that, but one of the treasure chests in Chapter 9 gives you the dual katana, which a trained Hana can use to make quick work of even the master ninjas. And even if you haven't trained up the most depressing Myrmidon in the franchise, Hinata joins ready to go as a filler replacement unit for her. His speed is pretty questionable, so he's not going to be as good at fighting them as a trained Hana, but he also takes no investment and can just do chunks to both the ninjas and master ninjas alike. Alternatively, at this point you could easily have trained up Rinka or an Oni Hayato, and therefore leverage clubs and axes against the ninjas. And once again, Hinata shows up as a failsafe because he can heart seal into the Oni class line to do a similar, if worse, job than the two of them. But you don't even need triangle advantage to be good against the ninjas. Oboro is weapon triangle neutral and can leverage lances to fight the ninjas. Or if you give her the heart seal, she can become an apothecary, using bows just as well as Takumi, Reina, and Mozu can. Don't get me wrong, Mozu is still going to have a good performance if you trained her up, but it is far less unique than it would be in Conquest. Especially since we haven't even run into any flyers yet. The first two enemy flyers you fight are in Chapter 12, and it is the sub-bosses Baruka and Camilla. There are also two generic wyverns in Chapter 13, but after this there aren't any flyers in main story chapters until all the way in Chapter 20. Yes, there are some paralogs for killing flyers. Kana's once again is early accessible and has threatening falcos, but the ability to leverage effective damage using bows is much more limited in Rev than it is in Conquest. Although, if you do want effective damage with a bow, and you are willing to use random My Castle drops or renown rewards, the Spellbane Yumi is surprisingly useful, considering just how many late-game Rev enemies use tomes of some sort. Now, the Spellbane Yumi is an interesting weapon because it doesn't have the Reaver effect, meaning that for the people it deals effective damage to, it will always be weapon triangle negative, taking a toll on the already quite sketchy hit rate. However, any bow user with access to the archer line can grab certain blow from sniper to add 40 to their hit and make up for the weapon triangle disadvantage. In fairness, adventurers can also grab Lucky 7 for a 20 hit and avoid boost on the first 7 turns, which can help mitigate the accuracy issues of Spellbane Yumi as well, but since it gives you less hit than certain blow and also is only active for the first 7 turns, I tend to find this to be more of a band-aid solution than an actual fix. For me personally, I don't use random castle drops or renown rewards, so Mozu finds herself mostly just relying on her pure strength, powerful archer skills, and weapon might for damage, without being able to leverage effectiveness terribly often. But usually this is enough to be a solid contributor to the team. All of this is to say that Archer is still an incredibly desirable, if slightly more accessible, class in the Revelation route. I think it's slightly weaker than it is in Conquest, but it's still easily in the top 5 class trees, and Mozu's growth rates are especially geared towards taking advantage of it. But all of this has been assuming that Mozu is able to access the Archer class line. As a villager, I don't love her prospects nearly as much. So the question remains, is Mozu usually going to be able to get a heart seal, or are they too contested by other units? At first, the answer seems obvious. Rev gives you twice as many seals via shop, and there are quite a few dropped in the campaign. In fact, once you clear Chapter 10, you have 4 available. 1 apiece from the Rod Shop and Staff Shop, 1 dropped by Fuga, and 1 dropped by a random fighter buried in the snow. Since competition wasn't steep enough to take Mozu out of the top 2 in Conquest, it seems clear that she is definitely in the top 4 in Rev, but she doesn't need to be in the top 4. In fact, Mozu wants to get the Heart Seal before Chapter 9, and so she's fighting over the 2 available from the level 1 shops. And despite the fact you don't have that many characters available for Chapter 9, there's a lot of people who want to use those early heart seals as soon as possible. I've already spoken in past videos about how Corin, Felicia, Jacob, and Gunter all really want one of those early seals, and already one of them is going to be missing out. But Sakura is also someone who really appreciates being able to shed her base class. Flight is quite useful in early game Rev, and while her combat isn't stellar initially as a Sky Knight, Sakura's growths excel in basically every area, and as a result, as a Sky Knight she can do decent physical combat until she gets C-rank lances, and then suddenly switch between physical and magical combat with the Bolt Naginata. Sakura is still useful as a Shrine Maiden, so it's very possible for her to use one of the later seals, but the sooner she can escape a Staff Log class, the better for her experience. With 5 units fighting over only 2 seals, getting Mozu into Archer for Chapter 9 is definitely more of an investment than it would be for Chapter 10 in Conquest. Personally, my order in terms of how much I think an individual Heart Seal helps your army is Corin, then Felicia, then Gunter, then Mozu, then Sakura, and finally Jacob, followed by any other units not on the list who I think are actively detrimental to Heart Seal prior to Chapter 9. Regardless of which servant you have, there are at least 2 units who I think benefit you from a Heart Seal more than Mozu will. But if you want to use Mozu, she really wants that Heart Seal, so compromises can be made. And it's not like Great Knight Gunter is going to be terrible on the Wind map either. It's 1 less flyer and, in my opinion, a worse backpack for Corin, but he still has decent combat and incredibly good shelter utility. And if you picked Corin's talent for the purposes of their spouse or child, then it's also fairly reasonable to not spend a Heart Seal on them, especially if you got the Azura friendship to send them Sky Knight so they can ditch the terrible noble class. Of course, the alternative is to wait. Maybe Mozu doesn't reclass for Chapter 9, but that's okay. Fuga and the Snow Fighter also drop heart seals, and Mozu can just take one of those. Maybe she sits on the bench for Chapter 9 because she wouldn't be much help as a villager anyway, or maybe she finds niche jobs to do as a villager. Surely it's relatively free to give one of the 4 pre-Chapter 14 heart seals to Mozu. Well, I would once again argue that that's not the case. The longer the game goes on, the more Sakura wants to leave Shrine Maiden. Whether that's through an early promotion, a heart seal, or a support chain will depend on your routing, but the heart seal is definitely a contender for a lot of builds. The mid-game also hands you a great deal of units, and Hayato, Hinata, Orochi, Oboro, Saizo, Baruka, and Selena are all units who could potentially desire a heart seal depending on your planned build. And if you're doing support routing that gives you early Paralouges, both Kana and Dwyer can appreciate a heart seal as well. Sure, some of these units can afford to wait until Chapter 14, and by then you are flush with seals, but Mozu absolutely cannot afford to wait until Chapter 14. It is really make or break that she gets an early seal. Waiting until after Chapter 9 is already bad enough for her. She starts at level 1 for Christ's sake. Again, this isn't to say that you're not getting your money's worth by investing a heart seal and experience into Mozu. It's just that that is a legitimate investment, and it is a bigger investment than in the Conquest route, for arguably a less good payoff. Kinshi Knight is a little bit weaker in Rev than it is in Conquest, and it's also much easier to get. In the first generation alone, you have a plethora of archers and Sky Knights, and in the second generation, even without individual mothers, Kiragi, Kaldori, and Shigure will always have access to it. So if the reason that you clicked on this video was to find out whether or not to add Mozu to your team, I would say if you enjoy these type of zero to hero units, she is going to pay dividends much better than someone like Ross or Amelia would. But if you're not a huge fan of training projects, or if there's another training project that's caught your eye, you're not missing out on anything essential by following the Geneva Conventions and refusing to hire a child soldier. But if you've already decided she's going to be a mainstay of your team, and the reason you're watching the video is to look into possible builds or just skills to give her, well, let's dive into that. The most straightforward way to use Mozu is simply to treat her like she's not a Fates unit. Once you pop her into Archer, leave her in that class until it's time to promote. Send her into either Sniper or Kinshi and potentially reclass her at some point to pick up both skills. Personally, I think Kinshi is favorable in both the mid-game and late game, whereas Sniper is what you want to go into for the very end game. Chapter 23 is the last map where flight is particularly important, so you can switch over to Sniper and benefit from better stats and bowfare, while also not facing arrow weakness. The boss of Chapter 24 also drops the Pursuer, the S-rank bow which can only be used by snipers, further incentivizing the change from Kinshi to Sniper. One of the biggest upsides to this is that while Mozu is incredibly investment hungry in the early game, she switches over to be incredibly self-sufficient once you give her the initial heart seal and the first few levels. This frees you up to focus both more concrete resources and more support routing on the other units in your army. I tend to think that most playthroughs can only afford to run 2 to 3 high investment units, and one of these should probably be a rally bot. So Mozu becoming ironically quite low investment can pay huge dividends. And it's not like the archer line doesn't provide her with a ton of useful skills anyway. Quick Draw coming at level 10 is incredibly useful, and Certain Blow from Archer level 5 adds 40 to her hit on initiation, which can help against some of the dodgier enemies in Rev, such as ninjas and swordmasters, although I do still think if you're facing swordmasters, you want to use the dual Yumi to reverse the weapon triangle. Rev loves throwing ninjas and swordmasters at you in the late game, so it's nice to have someone who can hit highly avoidant foes. Of course, there's ways that Mozu can benefit from minor investment without becoming a major project, and one of the easiest is through marrying Tsubaki. You see, while Kinshi Knight's promoted skills are Air Superiority and Amaterasu, both of which I think are kind of mediocre on Mozu, Fates has a funny quirk when you are in a promoted class that promotes from 2 different classes. If you have both of the potential unpromoted classes in your learn set, the game gets confused and doesn't know which one you promoted from, and as a result of that, it will give you the unpromoted skills from both classes. So, if Archer Mozu uses a Master Seal to promote to Kinshi Knight, but she is married to Tsubaki, therefore giving her the option to partner seal into Sky Knight, she will get the Sky Knight skills on her first 2 Kinshi level ups without ever having to spend a partner seal. Camaraderie is pretty mediocre on a unit like Mozu who wants to operate as a player phase nuke. It gives a 10% heal if you start turn with an ally within 2 spaces. Mozu's HP value is already quite low, in fact hilariously her personal HP base is -1. So it's not going to be healing her by much, and as I say, she'd rather focus on offenses than defenses. On the other hand, Darting Blow is incredibly useful. Just like Certain Blow, it increases your stats upon initiation, only this time instead of 40 hit, it's 5 speed. While Mozu is a naturally very fast unit, gaining that +5 speed can allow her to double some of the very fast enemies in endgame. Again, Sword Masters and Ninjas, who you are going to want to have answers for because they are freaking everywhere. Mozu can switch between using regular bows against the ninjas and dual Yumis against the samurai in order to always have weapon triangle advantage, double using Darting Blow, and be accurate using Certain Blow. This allows her to 1-2 punch some of the fastest and dodgiest enemies in the game with 100% accuracy. Truly incredible. However, if you're looking to do a little bit more investment, Mozu does have a couple of cool options from her base class of Villager, since it promotes into both Master of Arms and Merchant, each of which gives a powerful promoted level 15 skill. Life and Death from Master of Arms adds 10 damage to any attacks that you deal in exchange for also causing you to take 10 more damage from every attack that lands on you. For a unit like Mozu, who often isn't facing counterattacks and doesn't want to enemy phase anyway, this is mostly upside. Meanwhile, the Merchant class gives Spendthrift, which allows you to convert a gold bar in your inventory into an additional 10 damage and 10 protection when initiating combat. And getting these 2 skills in conjunction with each other is actually quite the rare combination. The only other unit who immediately comes to mind as being able to access it easily is Midori. And not only does this require her to inherit life and death from her father, but Midori is also a significantly worse unit than Mozu. Although she is one of my favorite children, and as a result, she's probably going to be one of the first Gen 2 units I do a video on. So if you, like me, are a Midori maxer, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that. Okay, plug out of the way, let's get back to the Mozu discussion. One of the neat things about this skill combination from Mozu is that all of these classes have access to either lances or bows. Archer has bows, Master of Arms has lances, and Kinshi and Merchant have both. As a result of this, Mozu is able to take these ranks into the various classes as she dips for skills. And while I do think that bows are typically going to serve her better than lances, getting from E to D in lances only takes 20 combats, and it's very easy to just find opportunities to use lances if you're a Kinshi or Merchant, that way you have D rank going into Master of Arms. I mean, heck, D rank lances is useful even if you're just staying in Kinshi, as the Beast Killer can deal effective damage to the various Dark Knights, Paladins, and Great Knights that are present throughout the early Vala chapters. And heck, Sword Catcher can help you out against the Sword Masters as well. It's almost as if it's made for that. But I'll be honest, despite gassing up this damage combination, I'm not a huge fan of it on Mozu for one simple reason. It requires combining multiple level 15 promoted skills, so it's not going to come online until very late in the game. While it's true that you could early promote Mozu in order to start working towards those level 15 skills sooner, and Fates' EXP formula remembers your early promotion in order to give you more experience at higher levels if you promote it early, all of this feels kind of counterintuitive to what Mozu wants to do. she has incredibly high growth rates. Let her use them. Don't get me wrong. I think there's absolutely reasons to early promote units in Fates. Short-term units who want to grab a level 5 promoted skill to pass down to their child, or long-term units who plan on class dipping a bunch to grab multiple promoted skills really appreciate having a lower internal level to make those skill grinds easier. But I really don't think Mozu is one of the units who would like to trade several unpromoted levels for faster access to promoted skills. Getting a level 15 promoted skill still comes quite late, even if you promote at level 10. And a 10-1 Sniper or Kinshi Mozu is not going to be performing significantly better than a level 12 Archer would. So I think if we're trying to pick up extra skills for Mozu, it makes more sense to look at what her support chains offer her. As I said earlier, I think the best marriage for Mozu is Tsubaki, giving her access to Sky Knight and the powerful Darting Blow skill. And as a bonus, this makes for quite a strong Kaldori as well. But if you have a different bride in mind for this franchise's first male Pegasus, Mozu will have to find a spouse elsewhere. Laszlo and Niles both offer Mozu access to the Bow Knight class. While it does clip Mozu's wings in comparison to Kinshi, it gives her slightly better stats while maintaining the same level of movement. Bow Knight's level 5 skill is Rally Skill, which doesn't really do much for Mozu, but level 15 does give Shuriken Breaker, which gives plus 50 hit and avoid if the enemy is using hidden weapons. I've mentioned it quite a few times, but a lot of the late game has enemy Master Ninjas, and so being able to not only nail them more consistently, but also avoid their counterattacks is quite useful for Mozu. Between Laszlo and Niles, I think Niles is definitely the more desirable spouse, because through him, Mozu gets outlaw skills, specifically Move +1, which does exactly what it says on the tin, increases her movement by 1. Lock Touch is nice utility, and while it doesn't do too much for Mozu, Mozu is a unit who doesn't usually have all 5 of her skill slots filled. So since you usually want at least 1 or 2 Lock Touch users, Mozu can just sort of be one of them. Heck, if you're only dipping into Bow Knight and then plan to go back into Kinshi later, having Lock Touch on a flyer is genuinely beneficial in chapters 22 and 23. The biggest downside to having Mozu marry Niles is you have to field Niles for 7 maps. Niles is one of the worst units in Fire Emblem Fates Revelation. Like everyone, he's not unsalvageable, but almost everything that he offers you can be done better by other units who join either earlier or around the same time. As such, it's understandable not to want him on the field for 7 chapters. Even if all he's doing is backpack duty, other people can do it better. But thankfully, Mozu can get Bow Knight from Laszlo, and Laszlo joins on the same map as Niles, so it doesn't even come later. The trade-off here is that mercenary skills are not super desirable for Mozu, since both Good Fortune and Strong Riposte focus on enemy phase gaming. Chapters 21, 24, and 25 do actually offer some good opportunities for enemy phasing with bows, especially if you have Shuriken Breaker, because there are groups of ninjas that you can bait into attacking Mozu. But in general, Strong Riposte and Good Fortune kind of feel like wastes of skill slots for Mozu. Personally, I think if you want to send Mozu Bow Knight, you should make Corrin's talent Outlaw and marry her yourself. Although this is favoritism because, as I always say, Corrin's marriage is an incredibly valuable and flexible one-of-a-kind resource. Whoever you give it to is going to benefit immensely. And while Bow Knight Mozu is neat, it doesn't feel like a significant enough upgrade from the Kinshi line to justify Corrin marriage. Alternatively, instead of marrying Corrin, you can choose to have Mozu marry one of the Christmas ninjas, giving her access to the powerful and highly desirable Ninja line. While unpromoted, Ninja functions kind of like a side grade to Archer for Mozu. Hidden weapons won't pack as much of a punch as bows would, but they do allow her to potentially enemy phase. And while Mozu's bulk is still a limiting factor, it is very possible to find situations where she can fight a single enemy or perhaps even 2 without dying. Interestingly, once Mozu promotes, she's one of the few units who would rather go Mechanist than Master Ninja, since this allows her to retain any bow rank that she gained in the Archer class. Mechanist only has 7 move as compared to most mounted units 8, but it's still better than an unmounted unit. And the combination of hidden weapons with bows allows Mozu some level of weapon triangle control. She can get advantage over mages and swordmasters without needing to use the dual Yumi. So if you have multiple bow users on your team, you can give the dual Yumi to someone other than Mozu while maintaining the ability to effectively fight red enemies. As far as the skills that Ninja offers, I wouldn't call them earth-shattering, but they're also not useless. Just like Outlaws, ninjas get Lock Touch at level 1, and it is still useful to have on Mozu. Poison Strike means that whenever you initiate against an enemy and don't kill them, they will take 20% of their max HP in non-lethal damage at the end of combat. Once you get to the late game and Mozu is routinely one-rounding, this can feel like a bit of a waste. But until then, it is surprisingly useful. Mozu's doing most of her combat on player phase anyway, so if there are bulky enemies that she can't kill, like paladins and generals, being able to deal extra chip damage can help to set up for your other units. Although, speaking of paladins and generals, one of the benefits that Ninja has is that hidden weapons gain 2 effective weapon types, the Hunter's Knife and the Sting Shuriken. The Hunter's Knife in particular is incredibly good at killing paladins and dark knights. Personally, I'm not super high on the Sting Shuriken. Generals are very bulky, so I'd rather have the High Might of Hammer. Still, a ninja Mozu with the Sting Shuriken does more against generals than an archer Mozu would with any bow. Master Ninja doesn't offer much in the way of useful skills, but Mechanist does have a cool one at level 15, Replicate. Replicate allows you to make a copy of the unit. These copies share most attributes, such as stats, including any from boosters or rallies, and equipped weapons. They also have a linked HP pool, so if one dies, the other one will as well. But having access to 2 copies of one of your strongest player phase units is quite good. And if you're raising Mozu from rags to riches, why bother settling for only having 1 strong unit as your payoff? With Replicate, you can get 2 super strong investment projects. It is potentially worth noting that replicas will not benefit from any support bonuses, so if you're having Mozu take advantage of guard stance or attack stance, then the replica is not going to be able to get those bonuses. But let's be honest, Mozu is very self-sufficient damage-wise. If there's one thing she's got, it's high numbers. She probably didn't need the bonus from A support Arthur in order to achieve that kill anyway. The only other bow class that Mozu can grab through marriage is Priestess by marrying Azama. This will come online at the same time as a Laszlo or Niles marriage due to the fact that chapters 16 and 17 are linked, meaning that even if you build a C support with Azama in chapter 16, you can't activate it until after chapter 17, meaning that you can't start working on your B support in chapter 17. Priestess is generally a fairly strong class, with well-rounded bases and growths and an emphasis on resistance for fighting against mages, which can help if you want to dual Yumi them. But I won't sugarcoat it. For Mozu, Priestess is worse than Sniper in almost every way. The 2 of them are tied for speed growth, and Sniper has a higher strength growth by 5%. Additionally, Sniper's bases are better in the areas that Mozu cares about. And while Sniper offers Certain Blow and Bowfare, both of whom are incredibly valuable skills for Mozu, Priestess offers instead Miracle, Rally Luck, Renewal, and Counter Magic, none of which contribute to the player phase killbot that Mozu wants to become. If you add onto this the fact that Azama is a very late joining unit, I honestly think the only reason you would have Mozu marry him is if you wanted her to pass an archer skill down to Mitama. Although even then, Setsuna passes the actual archer class line and has a fast support. Although, now that I mention Mozu as a mother, we should probably talk about that aspect of her kit. Mozu passes Villager down to her children, and for all the same reason that Mozu wants to leave the class herself, Generation 2 units are not going to be super keen on reclassing into it. Although, if you delay a child recruitment until after the offspring seals show up, you don't have to spend any time in Villager, and can instead take advantage of the 2 promoted options, Master of Arms and Merchant. I don't think Master of Arms is particularly noteworthy here. You would almost always rather grab it from inheriting the Samurai line, since you can also get Vantage through that. but Merchant is at least noteworthy in that it only promotes from Apothecary, and there are no Gen 1 units whose base class is Apothecary. As such, Mozu is the only way that a child other than Mitama, Midori, or Kiragi can access the Merchant class. So, if you have a child unit you really want to give the Profiteer Spendthrift combo to, Mozu has to be their mother. I already talked about Spendthrift. It converts gold bars into plus 10 damage, plus 10 protection on player phase. But Profiteer is the level 5 skill that goes along with it, and they're meant to play together. Profiteer gives you a luck % chance to get a gold bar on each of the first 7 turns of a map. This chance is rolled whenever the unit with it ends their turn. It is not rolled if the unit is a backpack, however it is rolled if the unit starts unpaired and uses their action to pair up. You can only roll Profiteer once per turn. If you fail the first attempt, you are unable to try again, either through dancing, sheltering, or gale force. It's one and done, baby. While the skill seemingly was designed to work in conjunction with Spendthrift to give you the gold bars that you can use for that, I know a lot of players are fond of Profiteer on its own as a way of generating extra money. After all, you can sell the gold bars for 300 gold apiece. However, I'm not a huge fan of this tactic for a couple of reasons. The first one is it's super unreliable. It's a luck % chance and it only works on the first 7 turns, so you can't use it to grind up. If you successfully get a gold bar every turn, it is 2100 gold. However, most units are not going to successfully get a bar every turn. Instead, for most players, it's going to be 1 or 2 bars per chapter, netting you a grand total of 600 gold per map. Sure, this is nice to have, especially if you're spending a lot of money on tonics, but I generally think people often overspend on tonics, without checking thresholds or looking for other ways to boost stats, such as pair-up partners. However, the larger reason that I'm not a fan of Profiteer is I just don't believe the gold issues are as extreme as many players make them out to be, whether it be Conquest or Revelation route. In fact, I see a lot of people say that Rev is the money route, but honestly, I really disagree with this notion. In Chapter 19, in addition to just being handed 15,000 gold, you also get a lot of droppable items, many of which can be sold for a decent chunk of change. You get one of each magic weapon, and it's unlikely you're using all of them. You get a large number of steals, and while you could use them for forging, you could also sell them for gold. You get a soldier's knife, which is an absolutely trash weapon, and yet somehow sells for 2,000 gold. A killer axe and killing edge, which are similarly bad and sell for 1,500. And the illusory Yumi, which feels like one of the more pointless weapons in the series. It gives you plus 10 res, but it has weapon triangle disadvantage against tomes. Between this and the Spellbane Yumi, I have a conspiracy theory that tomes, bows, and daggers being added to the weapon triangle was a very late addition in development, because otherwise it doesn't make sense to me that there are so many bows and bow classes that seem to specialize in fighting mages and yet have to face weapon triangle disadvantage if they are doing that. Regardless, I kind of wish that this was the My Castle weapon and the Spellbane Yumi was the real one, because Spellbane Yumi would be super useful. Regardless, my point is there's a lot of items clogging up your inventory you can just sell if you're short on money in Rev. And you really shouldn't be short on money in the late game. You get handed so much even after Chapter 19. And the game keeps giving you sellables. You get one of every S-rank weapon, and most classes cannot use S-ranks, so unless you have someone in the class to use the S-rank, you should probably just sell that weapon, and oftentimes it's worth selling the S-ranks even if you do have someone in the class that can use them, as weapon rank grinding is so slow that many units will not hit S, and a lot of the S-rank weapons are not worth wielding anyway. Shoutouts to Bifrost. Before entering Vala, things can be a little bit more tight, but as you're flooded with new recruits, each of whom has irons and steels, you can sell them for chump change to scrape your way to extra seals. Not only that, but the game gives you killer weapons in the early game, and just like the ones in Chapter 19, I think the best use case of those killers is to sell them too. But this kind of naturally brings me to the third reason I don't like Profiteer as a solution to gold woes. Because the one point in Revelation where I feel my purse is at its tightest is in the stretch of chapters between Chapter 14 and 19. Chapter 14 is when you first get the ability to upgrade your shops, and as a result of this, you can buy effective weapons, reavers, and magic weapons. Each of these tools is very powerful, but they're also quite expensive. And this alone would be enough to drain your coffers in many playthroughs, but they are actually accompanied by another source of financial strain. During this mid-game stretch, there are quite a few units who want to promote and/or reclass. And while Revelation does give you some Master Seals for free, it doesn't give you enough for the number of unpromoted units you are likely to field. Weirdly, Revelation gives you Master Seals super late into the game. There's one in a chest in Chapter 20 and another one in Chapter 21. But perhaps most hilariously, you get awarded a Master Seal as one of the bonuses for clearing Chapter 24 without breaking stealth. There are only 3 main story chapters after Chapter 24, those being Blades Drawn, which is a pretty long and drawn out map, and then the Valite King, which is a very easy map to skip, and the Endgame map. If you have an unpromoted unit who you need to promote in the last 3 maps of the game, I don't know what you were doing with your life. It's not even like Rev gives you any sort of est units. If you're late recruiting people in Rev, they come with offspring seals. And yet, for some reason, the Chapter 24 Master Seal is presented as having the same relative value as a pair of boots. I don't understand it. Were the devs on crack? Okay, sorry about that. I love Rev, but sometimes I lose my mind thinking about what led to the development decisions behind it. Getting back onto topic, even if Profiteer were able to reliably provide a meaningful amount of gold, the fact that it's a level 5 skill means that most units wouldn't be able to get it online on time for the period of the game where your wallet is most stretched. I already talked about why I think early promotion Mozu is a waste of her talents, but if you're giving Profiteer to a child unit, they will also need to use a Master Seal in order to get Profiteer before Chapter 19. Because in Chapter 19, Offspring Seals only promote you to promoted level 2. And if you get Profiteer after Chapter 19, you're kind of trying to fix a problem that you no longer have. You are flush with money during the late game of Rev. Not only does early promoting the Child of Mozu ruin the potential granted to them by her phenomenal personal growths, but it also doesn't even immediately give you Profiteer. You still need 5 promoted levels, at a point in time where most enemies are unpromoted, and as a result of this, an early promoted unit is not going to be gaining a ton of experience yet. Even if you immediately grab a child unit in Chapter 14, give them a Master Seal and a Heart Seal, and try to get them to Profiteer, they're probably not going to get it before like Chapter 17, Chapter 18. And by the way, you've spent a Master Seal and a Heart Seal to do this. That's 4,000 gold. That means you need to proc Profiteer 14 times before you're gold positive. And this nets you a grand total profit of 200 gold. The number of maps that it takes to get 14 Profiteer procs will obviously depend on both your unit's luck and your luck as a real-life person. But if we assume 3 procs per map, which is being quite generous, that's still 5 maps after you get a level 5 promoted skill. Meaning that in most cases, Profiteer is not going to be giving you a profit until after Chapter 19, which is the map that gives you $1.5 million. By the way, just as a side note, even if you Offspring Seal, you need to Heart Seal into Merchant in order to get Profiteer, which means that any child unit getting Profiteer from Mozu is going to need 7 maps before they are gold positive. In Chapter 19, and just to be clear, all of those calculations were done with the extremely generous estimate that they would be getting 3 gold bars on average per map. More realistically, I would say most maps you're gonna average 1 to 2 gold bars, and sometimes even less with particularly unlucky children. Although, I guess that segues us kind of nicely into which children like having Mozu as a mother. I think the children who benefit the most from a Mozu parentship are the ones who are good in their base classes and simply want a boost to their physical growths, alongside powerful skill inheritance. Mozu can pass down Archer's skills, but since she doesn't give the class itself, the child needs to be able to make good use of them in either their base class or their father's class. The first one to come to mind for me is Percy. His base class set of Wyvern and Fighter gives him just about everything he wants, especially since they keep the Axe rank between them and there aren't really any other notably good Axe classes. Sorry Oni Savage fans, it's just pretty mediocre. Mozu offers Percy the strength and speed he so desperately desires in order to make him into an incredibly powerful Wyvern Berserker or hero. Kaeldori is in a similar boat. While Samurai doesn't offer much for her, the Sky Knight line more than makes up for it, and she's perfectly competent as either a Falco or a Kinshi. While it's definitely less ideal than Setsuna giving her the Archer class line, Mozu being able to pass down one of these skills will still allow Kaeldori to be quite the strong Kinshi. And Merchant isn't even a terrible reclass for the perfect prodigy, since she's able to shed arrow weakness while maintaining her bow and lance rank. Valoria is always a giant ball of stats, so she appreciates getting more from Mozu, but personally I think she prefers a mother who passes a good class to her. The Wolf Segner and Fighter lines are fine enough, but Valoria has such good stats that it feels a shame to waste them on these classes. And neither Master of Arms nor Merchant solve this problem in my opinion. That being said, Valoria will have the stats of all time with Mozu Mother. 60% HP growth, 65% strength growth, 62% speed growth, and 50% defense growth as an unpromoted unit are, quite frankly, absurd. Soleil and Nina appreciate being able to take an Archer's skill and strong offenses into the Bow Knight line. And the reasons for this are much the same as why Mozu herself appreciates going Bow Knight. But Soleil can also reclass to Ninja and really appreciates the well-rounded growths from Mozu if she does so. You see, in her base class set, Soleil has access to both Hero for Soul and the Ninja class for Daggers. If you are at all familiar with Fate's meta discussion, then you'll be aware Soul Ninja is often presented as a very powerful build, especially in the Conquest and Birthright routes. For the uninitiated, the idea is that you grab the Soul skill from Hero, which is a skill percent chance to recover HP equal to half the damage you deal to your opponent on each attack. You then reclass out of Hero into a class with perpetual 1-2 range. Usually the recommended class is Master Ninja or Mechanist, although Butler and Maid can work, and for magical classes, basically any class with good speed and tome access will make do. The final step is to give your Soul Ninja a guard stance backpack and ensure they have the speed to double all enemies they are fighting. This will ensure that they gain 6 points of guard gauge per combat, since they get 2 for each attack that they land and 2 for each attack that lands on them. When your guard gauge maxes out at 10, you block the next enemy attack. And so, if you are doubling every enemy you fight, you will automatically block every other attack that the enemies land on you. This effectively doubles your survivability, turning a medium bulk enemy into someone who can effectively enemy face huge hordes. But you can supplement it further through the use of Soul, since every attack you land has a chance to recover some HP. And while on the surface this sounds unreliable, if you have a high attack and skill stat, it becomes much more dependable than you would think. If your unit dies in 4 hits, they can face 8 enemies. 8 enemies means 16 chances for Soul to proc. A level 5 Master Ninja is usually going to have skill in the high teens or low 20s, so if we assume the average of 20 skill, that is 1 out of every 5 attacks Soul is likely to proc. And if a Soul proc is what prevents you from dying to that 4th hit, then congratulations, your number of enemies you can fight went from 8 to 10. And 10 rounds of combat means 20 chances for Soul to proc, meaning that as your defense and skill stat go up, your ability to tank multiple enemies gets exponentially better. And that's before even factoring in things like avoid chance. Now, I've been pretty harsh to Soul Ninja in the past, because Revelation is the route of high stat benchmarks, and as a result of that, fewer units can reach those benchmarks than in the other two routes. You need a lot of speed to get to the point where you're doubling all opponents, and you need a lot of HP and defense to get to the point where you're surviving enough for Soul Ninja to start working its magic. But I do think there are some cast members who can make this build work, especially if you're selective about what targets you have them face. You might not be able to recklessly throw Soul Soleil into a group of 20 enemies like you can in Conquest, but if you select the correct number and correct types of foes, she can do quite fine, especially given the boosted growth rates from Mozu. Of course, there is another ninja who Mozu can be the mother of, and that is Asuji. And even though Mozu is not capable of passing Soul down to him, Saizo actually is, as Saizo can grab Soul from Laszlo Friendship. Mozu Asuji has slightly less raw strength and bulk, but he has a higher skill stat and access to the Samurai line, which gives 2 more skills that can really benefit a Soul Ninja, in the form of Vantage and Astra. Vantage means that if you have 50% or less HP, you will always go first, even when the enemy initiates. This can make guard gauge math a little bit more funky, but it is usually more beneficial than harmful, as you can build guard gauge before the enemy gets a chance to attack using Vantage. It also allows you to finish off weaker foes before they can deal damage to you, and gives you extra opportunities to proc Soul when you're missing HP. Astra, on the other hand, is a skill divided by 2 chance to land 5 attacks instead of 1. These 5 attacks only deal half damage, but they each build guard gauge as much as a regular attack would. The 5 hits from Astra will build a full guard gauge, thus negating an additional attack. And if you have Vantage online, using Astra to kill someone before they can land a hit continues to make it so you can fight more enemies. The biggest downside of having Mozu mother a Soul Ninja, whether it be Soleil or Asuji, is she doesn't really have any good skills to pass down to them. The Archer line focuses on player phase skills, and that's not what Soul Ninjas really want to do. Along the same vein, the Villager line doesn't really give anything that complements this build. And Mozu's friendship classes are not the most desirable in the world. I guess defense +2 from Armor Knight from Effie friendship could help. In a similar vein, while Mozu makes a pretty decent parent for Kiragi, since she offers the strength and speed that he wants, turning him into basically a Gen 2 version of Bowzu, Kiragi already has access to Archer skills. He at least appreciates either Life and Death or Spendthrift, but that requires Mozu to get to promoted 15. And considering Kiragi is already in a situation where it's likely his father doesn't have a good skill to pass down to him, adding that same problem from his mother feels really bad. Overall, while Mozu Kiragi will still be decent, I think there are better mothers for him, which is good because the Mozu Takumi marriage also doesn't offer much to Gen 1 units. Now, you may be wondering why I didn't suggest Mozu pass Aptitude onto her children. After all, if the major case for her as a mom is she's going to pass very good stats, passing 10% more of those stats would be quite helpful, right? Well, unfortunately, Aptitude is a little bit weird when it comes to the Generation 2 units. If you pass Aptitude down as skill inheritance, it will not affect the growth rates of the Gen 2 kids while they auto-level in the deep realms. While this initially seems counterintuitive, there is a reason for it. What skills get given to a Gen 2 unit is determined upon the point that they spawn. They will check for both of their parents' skills and inherit whatever is in the final skill slot for each parent. Although if there is overlap, they won't inherit the same skill twice, and instead work backwards on that parent until they find a fresh skill, or run out of skills that are equipped. However, based on the structure of the child paralogs, some of the Gen 2 units will spawn multiple times. For example, in Kana's paralog, they spawn as a NPC green dragon who is not recruitable. Then, after you clear the paralog, they spawn an additional time as a noble. Percy spawns as an enemy in his paralog, and then spawns again as a blue unit upon clearing the map. Interestingly, there's a couple of child units for whom this is variable. Rajat spawns as a red unit on her map, and if you talk to her and recruit her, she will have the skill set that she has as a red unit. However, if you kill her, she will respawn after the map and could possibly have a new skill set if the parental skills that get passed down have been changed. This can lead to some very funny scenarios. For example, if you want to make Rajat's map easier, you can enter the chapter with a detrimental skill such as Gamble equipped in your final slot. Red Rajat will see Gamble and inherit it. However, you can then in preps change the equipped skills, kill the Red Rajat, and when she respawns as a blue unit, she will check for skills and additional time and inherit whatever new skill you have put in the final slot. Because of this, prior to the children spawning, they will not have Aptitude equipped, and since they auto-level in the Deep Realm chapters prior to spawning, they will auto-level without the Aptitude bonuses. That means for all of your unpromoted levels, you will not get the bonuses from Aptitude. Instead, it will only begin once they are a blue unit. However, for the units who you recruit late into the story, if you have an Offspring seal, they use the Offspring seal as a blue unit. So the Aptitude bonus will be applied to any auto levels they gain from the Offspring seal. As a result of this system, I would generally recommend against inheriting Aptitude on any of your child characters unless you have nothing better. But if you are late recruiting someone and they're going to get 10 to 15 levels in their Offspring seal anyway, it's not the worst thing in the world. Like, there are definitely far better skills than Aptitude to give the Gen 2 units, but there's also far worse ones. Now, while Mozu passes the Abysmal Villager class to Gen 2 units, the Generation 1 units are much luckier, as they are unable to inherit Villager and as a result, grab the Archer class instead. I already spent quite a while talking about why Archer is such a good class, and almost any physical unit appreciates being able to access it, whether it's permanently or just for the powerful skills. Tsubaki is a particularly notable beneficiary of this because he can do the opposite of what Mozu does with Sky Knight skills, i.e. when he promotes to Kinshi Knight, he can grab skill +2 and quick draw without needing to spend a partner seal. While both Christmas ninjas would almost certainly prefer to stay in the ninja line long term, the ability to dip into sniper for quick draw and certain blow is certainly appealing, especially for Kaze, who can struggle with his noodle arm entering the mid game and late game. Even just spending 2 unpromoted levels for quick draw is often worth the partner seal on its own. And Laszlo and Niles, the other 2 husbands I recommended for Mozu, also appreciate Archer access. That's one of the cool things about Mozu's preferred marriages. Oftentimes they benefit all 3 units involved, the husband, the wife, and their child. That being said, there are a few selfless Mozu marriages that you can go for if you want. Mozu Silas gives Silas a way out of the Cavalier class line, and Kinshi is quite a good class to have in Vala, allowing Silas to keep his lance rank and use bows when necessary. In general, if you want Kinshi Knight Silas, I think going for Hinoka marriage is a better route, as that will give him Darting Blow to help fix his middling speed, but this is an option if Hinoka is otherwise occupied. In theory, Mozu can benefit from this one too, because Elbow Room is a good skill, but I don't think it's good enough to justify 2 partner seals. The other Norian unit who really likes getting Archer access is Keaton. Keaton is a huge ball of stats, but he's stuck with some pretty uninspired base classes. Wolfsegner is good early on, allowing him to deal effective damage to Paladins and Great Knights who can otherwise be difficult to kill. But because the Beast Stone Plus and Beast Ruin come so late, Keaton often wants to leave Wolfsegner in order to fight with real weapons. Unfortunately, his base class option is Fighter, which is not going to help his accuracy issues since skill is the only stat that Keaton does not excel at. Sniper addresses this both by giving an innate +10 hit bonus and by giving access to Certain Blow, which makes up for all of Keaton's accuracy issues and then some. Keaton's Hoshidan counterpart, Kaden, is in a similar situation, wanting to leave the Kitsune class once the Beast Stone stops being useful. He also has a shitty Heart Seal class in Diviner. And because his speed is sky high, making him into a very fast sniper can be beneficial for both him and his daughter Silky if you want to use them. Lastly, Azama appreciates the archer line, especially if you're willing to spend a Heart Seal on him, since he keeps his bow rank from Apothecary when entering archer classes. Although, speaking of Apothecary, while I wouldn't recommend this marriage, I do feel the need to point out Mozu marriage gives Takumi the Apothecary class line, which is relatively rare in all of Fates. This is because Mozu is unable to pass Villager to Takumi due to it not being transferable within Gen 1, and unable to pass Archer to Takumi because it is his base class line. As a result of this, Takumi inherits the parallel class to Villager, which is Apothecary. I tend to think that Archer is just better than Apothecary for the most part, but if you want to grab the Apothecary skills on Takumi, this is the only way to do so without Corrin marriage. And one niche benefit is it lets him access Mechanist without needing to spend Kagira marriage, thus letting you get Replicate on him and cosplay as the final boss of the Conquest route. But it's not just the male units that can benefit from Mozu's support chain. In fact, Mozu is able to pass Archer to 3 of the female members of the cast by accomplishing A+ with them. And because friendships are one way, theoretically in a single playthrough, she could pass Archer to all 3 of these ladies. These lucky ladies are Oboro, Effie, and Nyx, and all of them do appreciate access to the Archer line. Oboro is a very strong mid-game unit with access to the Apothecary line via her Heart Seal, so she can do the same thing that Azama does, but much earlier and much more effectively, building her bow rank as an Apothecary and then reclassing to the Archer line once she completes the friendship. Merchant and Kinshi are a class set that works well together because they share the same weapon grouping of lances plus bows. And Oboro in particular makes really good use of this combination because she has a base lance rank of C, and will build her bow rank very quickly if you are using her as an Apothecary. That being said, Mozu is not Oboro's only way to access the Archer line. Oboro has a fast support with Takumi, so while this takes one more chapter than the Mozu friendship, it also gives you a child unit and a paralogue for your trouble, which in my opinion is worth more than simply the reclass. That being said, if you want Archer Oboro and you are marrying Takumi to someone else or simply not using him this playthrough, Mozu being able to provide it is a genuine benefit. The 2 Norians that Mozu can friendship appreciate Archer even more than Oboro though. Effie is an armor knight with an incredibly high strength and speed growth, but a really bad base class, and she wants to leave armor as quickly as possible. While there are a few marriages she can do to accomplish this, the fastest route out of plate armor is with Mozu friendship, and Effie's high strength and speed synergize really well with the Archer class. She also brings her lance rank into Kinshi Knight, giving her a similar benefit to Oboro. Nyx, on the other hand, is a bit of a more untraditional archer. She's a magically oriented unit, but her Heart Seal class is Outlaw, allowing her to build up her bow rank while working on the support with Mozu. While she will initially have to use physical bows, hampering her damage output significantly, upon reaching C rank she can switch over to the extremely powerful Shining Bow. Much like I talked about in Mozu's section herself, being able to combine Outlaw skills with Archer skills is quite powerful. And being able to do that while acting as a magical nuke is something entirely unique to Nyx. Nina can either be a Shining Bow user or someone with the Archer class line, but she's never going to be good at both in the same run. And all of the other units with access to the Archer line have abysmal magic stat, so they would prefer to stick to physical bows anyway. Nyx also benefits immensely from the Sniper class skill of Certain Blow, since Nyx has an incredibly shaky accuracy due to her poor skill and luck stats. Although Lucky 7 from Outlaw can do a decent job of patching up accuracy without Mozu's help. But considering how many dodgy enemies there are in late game Rev, it's honestly potentially worthwhile to just grab both of them, With plus 60 hit from your skills, you're not missing anything. Now, this is arguably the best way to use Nyx, but I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of it. It's incredibly high investment, especially since you have to purchase the Shining Bow if you want it prior to Chapter 21, unless you grab one from Nina's Paralouge, but oftentimes in Rev, you're not fielding Niles enough to get Nina's Paralouge. Not only that, but during the training arc, Nyx is going to be quite the abysmal unit. This build has slightly better prospects in Conquest, so if you want to try out Shining Bow Nyx, I would recommend that route, and if you're doing that, check out fellow YouTuber Coding Ant's series about Shining Bow Nyx, which should be linked in the description. That being said, if you are trying to use any or all of these 3 units, a Mozu friendship is something genuinely worth considering. The only unfortunate thing is that all 3 of these are pretty selfless friendships for Mozu. The Spear Fighter, Knight, and Dark Mage lines don't really offer much for the Villager girl. Although, because she does have the capacity to give Archer to 4 separate units in the same run, there is the possibility of just fielding an untrained Mozu simply to build support ranks. And if you're going to do that, you're probably going to have her on backpack duty, so it's worth examining how Mozu works as a backpack. Archer actually gives decent bonuses. With 2 speed, 2 strength, and 2 skill, almost any physical unit can appreciate this boost. It's nothing crazy like Berserker, but it is respectable. That being said, if you want to make Mozu into an Archer backpack, you're spending a heart seal on her, and if you're doing that, why is she a backpack? So instead, let's take a look at the bonuses from the Villager class line. She gives 3 skill and 3 luck, both of which contribute to hit, which is really nice. In addition to that, Mozu's personal support bonuses are almost entirely skill and luck. At S support, she will give 5 of each, alongside a point of speed. This is some pretty incredible stuff if you care about reliability. Now, let's quickly type this into the calculator and see just how much hit you get from all of these skill and luck bonuses. You get 10 hit. Congratulations, we reinvented attack stance bonuses. For the uninitiated, the reason that 10 hit at S support is so bad, even if you care about reliability, is that you get 10 hit for free just by being in attack stance with someone. Even if you don't have a support level, you just get a free 10 hit. In addition to this, Mozu gives 5 hit in attack stance at both B and S rank, meaning an S rank Mozu will give you 20 hit in attack stance, in addition to the 15 crit avoid that she gives from C, A, and S combined. I can see a theoretical situation where you want to have guard stance because you're enemy phasing, but you also care about boosting your hit rate up, so having an S support Mozu backpack is nice, but I feel like that's not going to come up very often in the average playthrough. Even if you want to get 100% on all of your hit rates, just put Mozu in attack stance. Or better yet, put Arthur in attack stance. So yeah, Villager Mozu backpack really is not good. But I've been avoiding talking about it this whole time, but I guess we should tackle how Villager Mozu performs if you want to turn her into an actual combat unit without spending a heart seal. About an hour ago, I brought up Sky Knight Sakura and how her base combat is pretty bad, but she shows some potential, and particularly astute viewers might have noticed that she actually has nearly identical bases to Villager Mozu. And not only that, but Mozu's physical growths are just better than Sakura's. Both of them have the same lance rank of E as well, so with that in mind, you might be wondering why I'm so low on Villager Mozu, despite being willing to recommend Sky Knight Sakura. And the reason for that is Sakura going into Sky Knight brings a lot of benefits both to her and your team, which are simply not present for Mozu. Sakura reclassing out of a staff block class lets her actually gain experience at a reasonable rate, which isn't going to happen in Shrine Maiden. Not only that, but building her lance rank early on allows her to hit C at a much more reasonable time frame. And C rank lances are important for Sakura because it gives her access to the Bolt Naginata, Bolt Naginata is a very strong magical weapon that Sakura can bring into other classes, like Falco Knight and Basara, in order to deal massive amounts of damage. But even if you don't care about training Sakura's lance rank, giving her flight is helpful on a variety of maps, both because she can ferry other units around using the pair-up system, and because flight gives her flexibility of where to position herself. Since Sakura's personal skill is an aura you want to apply to as many units as possible, being able to have her over the emptiness in Chapter 9 or over some of the forests in Chapter 11 is beneficial. On the other hand, Mozu can gain combat experience whether she's in Villager or Archer, and her being in the Villager class line doesn't give any benefits to the rest of your team. Since all Mozu offers you is combat, and her combat in Villager is significantly worse than Archer, really the only reason to use her in Villager is if you like her animations, which, to be fair, they are incredibly adorable. Like, just look at her nervously shaking as she goes to attack with the Naginata, it's peak. Lances hurt Mozu's matchups pretty significantly in Chapter 9. She has advantage over the Samurai and the Diviners now, but these enemy types are much rarer than the others. If you've gotten her 20 combats in Invasion 1 and Paralouge 1, then theoretically she could attack uncountered with the Javelin, but this is going to be a much worse weapon than the Bronze Bow even is. And because it hampers her speed so much, you can forget about countering ninjas on enemy phase. Mozu already had a poor matchup against the Onis, but at weapon triangle disadvantage, it's basically hopeless. And against the spear fighters, she's similarly not doing much other than chip damage. In Chapter 9, you have one fewer deployment slot than units you can deploy, and I'll be honest, if you're trying to make Villager Mozu work, consider benching her for Chapter 9. Even an untrained Hana will likely contribute more due to the backpack bonuses that she gives. And Chapter 10 is kind of a training project map anyway. Normally I use this map to funnel kills into Hayato and Sakura, but if you want to train up Mozu, this is a good map to do that as well. There are at least a good deal of red enemies in Chapter 10, and you can do a decent job isolating them if you know the positions of your foes under the snow. But Chapter 11 is once again going to offer a mediocre performance for Villager Mozu at best. She has neutrality against the ninjas, which in theory puts her at a better situation than Hana and Hinata, but you also get a dual katana for free, so they can have advantage over the ninjas as well. Being lance-locked is just a really big detriment in the mid-game. And that being said, there is another unit who makes lances work quite well in mid-game rev, and that is Oboro, whose stats are not actually that much higher than a level 10 villager Mozu's would be. And speaking of Oboro, if Mozu is going to be remaining in the villager line, then those friendships that I mentioned earlier become a lot less selfless. Spearfighter is almost strictly an upgrade in comparison to Villager, only losing out in the luck stat. And the two skills that it offers can be genuinely useful in the mid-game. Seal Defense reduces an enemy's defense by 6 after you initiate combat to them. They will recover 1 point of defense per turn, but this is largely irrelevant because if you're sealing their defense, you're probably setting up to kill them with whoever you follow up with. Most of your units are not strong enough to one round without effective damage in mid-game rev, and as a result of this, being able to seal particularly bulky promoted enemies' defenses can make it easier for you to have 2 units combined to kill them. Alternatively, even in the late game, seal defense can be useful if you are trying to have a unit class dip in order to learn skills in a class that they're not super sufficient in. I think the primary use case for this in the late game would be setting up for rally bots to get kills, but it's also quite useful if you're trying to do some more meme-worthy high investment builds. Swap is a lot more niche. It lets you switch places with an adjacent blue unit. This can help with positional flexibility or if a unit is in danger and you need to switch places to save them. It's also useful in some low turn clears, most notably Chapter 13's 1-turn, although I tend to think that low turning and especially 1-turning Fates maps loses you out on more than it gains you. Each chapter is an opportunity to build support points and experience on the rest of your army, and just 1-turning them can often deprive you of resources for the late game. Oboro is definitely the strongest friendship option for a lance-focused Mozu, but you could also potentially grab Knight from Effie if you want to try and shore up her bulk. The skill Defense +2 gives you 2 points of defense, again one of those very self-explanatory skills. And Natural Cover gives you a damage reduction of 3 if you're standing on a terrain tile. This is cool because it synergizes with Mozu's personal skill, Forager, which gives you a 20% heal if you start turn in a mountain, woods, waste, or field space. Unfortunately, I don't think that this skill, or in fact a defensive build for Mozu, are particularly strong. There's actually a surprising shortage of terrain tiles that activate Forager in the Rev campaign. You will find some, especially in the Outdoor Vala chapters, but a lot of the mid-game takes place in cities or indoor maps, and the same applies for late-game Rev. And in those Vala maps that I mentioned, Mozu is often a Kinshi Knight, and as a result of this, can find herself in emptiness very frequently. But even in the rare instances where you get Forager to work, Mozu's HP stat is depressingly low. I believe I mentioned this earlier, but she actually has a personal HP stat of -1, and none of her favorite classes do much to offset that. Yes, she has a 50% growth rate, so she will actually grow HP more often than a lot of other units, but she starts at such a detriment that it takes 5 levels before Forager will get her more than 2 HP on proc. Defense stacking Mozu can work, especially if you go into the Knight line via Effie friendship, but Knight itself is an incredibly limiting class. It has lower movement than even other infantry classes, and it doesn't really offer you anything in the way of promoted skills. Great Knight is probably the better path for Mozu because you actually get a functional movement stat, but even then, it feels like it really hampers Mozu's potential. Survival thresholds in Rev are incredibly high, and so most units can't really function as defense tanks. I think it's much better to focus on player phase offense rather than trying to make enemy phase tactics work. Now, if you do stick with the villager class for the long haul, when you promote, you will get rewarded with the ability to grab bows in the merchant class line. Even stuck in E-rank hell, Bronzebow does a lot of heavy lifting. And because of Mozu's natural stat spread, you do still end up with a very competent unit in the end. Just the grind becomes so much more painful, and the payoff is meaningfully worse, lacking access to Archer's skills as well as flight. As for where this places Mozu on the tier list, she is an odd duck. She's very resource hungry early on, but once you reclass her and feed her that initial experience, she becomes incredibly self-sufficient and one of the least resource-hungry units in your army. So it's hard to determine just how much of a high-invest unit she is. I feel like she comes closer to medium investment, but the period of time you need to invest in her comes much earlier. The Archer line is incredibly strong, and personally, I think bows are the best generic weapon type in the game. And by generic weapon type, I'm referring specifically to the brass, bronze, iron, and steel variants, so discounting things like PRFs and effective weapons. If you are willing to put in the legwork, Mozu does become an incredibly strong bow unit, but this route has no shortage of strong bow units. As early as Chapter 11, you get handed Takumi and Reina, and as the game goes on, more options like Shura, Kiragi, and Kaldori become available. Mozu does have advantages over some of these units, but a lot of them have advantages over her, most notably not needing heavy EXP investment, or an early heart seal. I think that the downside of the training arc is enough to land Mozu in B tier, likely somewhere near the middle or potentially bottom of the tier once it fills out. Don't let this discourage you if you want to use Mozu in your run, however. The training arc is real, and a trained Mozu will outshine most other bow units at the end of the game. But it's impossible to deny that in order to pull this off, Mozu does need special attention in the early chapters. And the early chapters are hard enough without going out of your way to feed training projects, which is unfortunately going to be a running theme as we talk about Sakura Squad. Looping all the way back to the question I posed at the beginning of the video, I think that Rev Mozu just sort of falls in the middle of her Conquest and Birthright iterations. She's nowhere near as bad as she is in the Hoshiden route, but in Nor, what she offers is more unique and the training arc is much easier. But what do you think? Have you ever used Mozu in Rev, or heck, in the other 2 routes as well? What do you think about her, and how do you think she compares to the other trainees in Fire Emblem? I'm curious to hear your thoughts down below. Today's comment code word is adopted, so make sure you include adopted in your comment so I know you made it to the end of the video. And now it's time to thank my patrons. Thank you to Eris, Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Mayor McLean, Calamity Callie, Thaythom, Andu, Reflect, A Clever Username of Lies, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, Floahay, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Roman Kormanczyk, Nick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Belwenska, Dysyke, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Aerith Emblem, Adele, and especially my Jagans, Justin Robinson, Kyle Madison, Autumn Kelsey, and Lilzabeth. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to the Patreon below. Benefits include things like early videos, votes that influence the channel, and some other stuff that's a bit too spicy to talk about here. In particular, my patrons are currently voting to determine the next unit I talk about in this series, and will in general be deciding what order I go over the Rev cast in, with the exception of a few units who I want to talk about at specific times, such as wanting to talk about Kana before the rest of Generation 2. With that being said, I've probably yapped for long enough, so I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.